Hello and welcome, Sean Fox here, and you're watching Made to Ramble. Much like the last episode, which was kind of a review of the Insta360 in this episode we'll be taking a look at another very compact camera that I've actually had for quite a while, which, once again, I've only just finally gotten around to playing with. But fear not, I've spent about 6 weeks now playing with this camera in a variety of different situations, and I think I'm starting to get a pretty good sense of what this camera is capable of. As you've probably guessed from the title, we'll be taking a look at this, the Sony RX100vii. So before we start, let's get this out of the way. This is not going to be an unbiased review. While I did pay for this camera myself, and nobody's paying me for this review. God, do I only wish. Nope, I've not been bought off for this review, but nor is it entirely objective. I don't really think any review is truly objective. We're all going to show off our favourite shots and the best looking video. You're really only going to see the successful stuff. I'm hardly going to show off all my screw-ups. On top of that, my experience with this camera has just been awesome, so I'm likely to be pretty gushing in my praise. Also, I suppose, given that I've spent my own money here, kind of going to be justifying the insane price tag of this little camera. All of that said, though, I'll be doing my best to give as much of an insight into my experience with the camera so that you can get some idea of whether or not it's the right product for you. Firstly, though, it should be noted that my own interests lie mostly with travel stuff, particularly landscapes and wildlife. I have very little interest in portraiture. Not really all that comfortable posing people, you know. I'm interested in both photo and video, so it's really important to me the cameras that I use are decent hybrids. While I do some occasional paid work, it's mostly a hobby for me. Photography and videography for me are mostly a means of managing what has historically been quite severe depression. It gets me out of the house, and luckily I've picked up some skill along the way. So with all of that out of the way, I've got a heap of footage here to show you and lots to talk about, so let's get on with it. First up, we'll get straight into the negatives. I always like to start with the negatives. Number one negative, price. This camera is really expensive. In Australia, it costs around $15.99 Australian dollars and around $12.98 in the US. For that sort of price, you could pick up an A6400 with the kit lens. That has an APS-C sensor, which is much larger than the piddly little 1-inch sensor of this RX100. The A64 will be better in low light. You'll be able to achieve shallow depth of field, and you can change the lenses. Of course, it's not going to fit into your pocket, but, you know, it's still pretty small. If I were recommending a camera for the average person, I'd much sooner recommend the A6400 than this. In fact, for most people, I don't recommend buying a camera at all. For those who aren't really experienced photographers, you're generally going to get better results with your phone. Mobile phones use a lot of clever computational trickery to compensate for the tiny little sensors they have. They take multiple photos and combine them to provide larger dynamic range and to improve the image quality in low light. For most people, the image quality you get from a modern smartphone is more than enough. So then, who the hell is this camera for? Well, it's for me, I guess. It's for an enthusiast or a professional who wants top-notch image quality with a really large focal range in a body small enough that you can fit in your pocket. Not just a jacket pocket, mind you, but the front pocket of your jeans. I mean, it may look like you have a weirdly shaped erection, but nonetheless, in a pinch, it fits without much trouble. Now, there are probably a lot of people who would turn their noses up at the RX100 Mark VII, or the previous model, the 6, which shares the same lens. There are many who just prefer the smaller 24 to 70 equivalent lenses on the earlier models, or on the newer ZV-1. I can kind of see their point. The smaller lens allows for the addition of a built-in ND filter and for a wider aperture overall. While the earlier models sported an aperture range from 1.8 on the wide end to 2.8 on the telephoto, Mark 7 starts at 2.8 and finishes at 4.5 on the long end, so it's not going to handle all that well in low light. With that said though, with such a small sensor compared to APS-C or full frame, none of these cameras are great in low light situations, and it can be argued that you'll get better results with your phone. But this, for me, is the major difference. Nobody has brought out a mobile phone with a lens that starts at 24mm and extends all the way to 200. Nor does any phone have the autofocus performance or 20 frames per second burst rate that this camera has. It's that focal range and those crazy burst rates that really set this camera apart from the competition. This, to me, is possibly the most versatile camera that I've ever owned, and it's even more remarkable for its tiny form factor. In fact, this is a camera with extraordinarily few compromises. But wait, I'm still supposed to be talking about the negatives. What other negatives are there? As I've mentioned before, this camera does not have an ND filter, unlike the earlier models prior to the Mark 6. For many, this could be a deal breaker, but it is worth noting that there are a couple of options for adding one if you really feel that it's necessary. There's a little stick-on mount that you can put on the front, which would allow you to mount any 52mm screw-in filters. This is a pretty good option for video, I think, if you're wanting to stick to the 180-degree rule, but if I recall correctly, you do get a bit of vignetting with these filters when taking photos because it's using the whole sensor. So my own solution for this issue was to buy one of these kits. In this case, the filter holder just slides straight on to the end of the lens, like so. And the kit comes with not only an ND16 filter, but also an ND grad filter, a polarizer, and a night filter to reduce light pollution for astrophotography. Weirdly enough, I have actually gotten a little bit of vignetting in some circumstances with this setup, but if you just move it onto a slight angle like this, the vignetting goes away. I've not had this filter kit for long, so I can't be too sure of what effect that it might have on the zoom motors, but I think as long as you remember to take it off before you turn off the camera, it's probably not going to be much of an issue. So one of the major reasons why you might want to use an ND filter is because you're wanting to record video in one of the flat log profiles like Slog 2. That said though, I don't recommend using log with this camera at all. I've had plenty of experience using log profiles with full frame cameras, and with a little bit of grading I could make it look pretty nice, but that was not the case at all with this camera. Every time I used log with this camera, the footage just ended up looking really mushy and lacking in detail. I can't say for certain that this isn't just a user error problem, but for me, I just prefer to use one of the cine profiles. They're nowhere near as flat, but I can get a whole lot more detail and the colors end up looking much nicer. Also, it means you don't necessarily need to use an ND filter as long as you don't mind closing the aperture down a bit, or a lot on a really bright day. Anyway, it gives you a few more options. So what else is there to complain about? So there's a mic jack, but no way to mount a mic on the camera itself due to the lack of a hot shoe. Now, there's a couple of solutions to this. My first idea was to use like a little ceramic mic like this fella. It turned out being way too sensitive and the audio just kept clipping when I used this.
folks, welcome aboard Bustleton Jetties, Docker Preston Express, our little electric train. My name is Ray, and I'm going to take you right out to the end of the jetty here today, all the way back again. So sit back and relax, have your cameras ready, you just never know what you might see along the journey.
My second idea was to use the camera on this little tripod like this. Has its own cold shoe here, and it could actually work out pretty well for vlogging, especially if you extend it like that. So while I'm not exactly the biggest fan of this sort of walk and talk vlogging, I thought I'd give you some idea of what that looks like with this setup. In this case, I've not got any stabilization applied in camera, and I'll instead be applying stabilization in post using the free Sony Catalyst Browse software. One important thing to remember when using the Catalyst Browse software is that you must use a faster shutter speed. So whereas under normal circumstances for a frame rate of 25 frames per second, I would be using a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. In this case, I'm using 1/400th of a second because with less motion blur, it actually gives the software more data for its stabilization. If you don't use a faster shutter speed, which is a mistake I made earlier, you end up with some pretty gnarly looking footage. Gnarly? Just shit. If, however, you don't really want to add that extra step of applying stabilization in post, here's what this setup looks like with active stabilization turned on. And the eventual solution that I found was this awesome little mic from Olympus. Allows for recording stereo audio without the need for a hot or cold shoe mount. You can use it just like this, straight into the side, or alternatively you could use it with some sort of right angle adapter to get a more faithful stereo recording. So the mic does not come with a furry windscreen. I just had to set this up myself with stuff that I had lying around the house. In this case, I've used a foam windshield from a lavalier mic for each of the microphones, and then this larger fur windshield on top with a little drawstring. I'm not sure where the windscreen actually came from. I just found it in a drawer, but I'm sure you can find something similar on Amazon. Anyway, it works really well for protecting from the wind, and the mic sounds great. Have a listen. It might lack a little on the bass end, but that's something that you can fix in post. And most importantly, of course, this mic does not distort at normal volumes, unlike that little Saramonic mic, which distorted when you had it turned down to 1 on the volume. Another thing to mention is that this doesn't have a headphone jack. I haven't found this an issue myself, but could be an issue for some people. So yeah, anything else to complain about? There's no 4K 60. If you want slow motion, you're relegated to 1080p or lower. That said, you do get a lot of options for frame rates, all the way up to 960 frames per second. The 960 frames per second, I think, is at a pretty low resolution. The fastest usable frame rate that I would use is around 240 frames per second, and I would only be using that very sparingly. I think the resolution is not much higher than standard def, so I'd probably be wanting to upscale to 4K using something like Topaz Video Enhance AI. What else? Overheating. Not had any issues myself. There's a setting that you can change that allows you to record video indefinitely. This is a whole lot better than the 5-minute record limit that you had with most of the earlier versions. I expect you could still probably get it to overheat on a hot day or if you really pushed that record limit, but I can say in my experience, while the camera has gotten quite hot, I've not received any warnings and it hasn't shut itself off. So far, none of these complaints really seem like complaints. I mean, I've pretty much had a solution for each problem, maybe with the exception of the log footage looking a bit shit. So what's wrong with the camera that can't be fixed? The menu system is Sony's older menu system. It's not super easy to navigate, and you can't use the touchscreen to navigate through the menus either. In fact, you can't even do that on the newer cameras. Well, you can modify what the buttons do and set up your own memory recall thingies. It's a pretty small camera, so you'll find yourself having to dive into the menu systems a little more often than what you would have to with a larger camera. It's just a matter of getting used to the menus, I guess. The viewfinder's a little bit small, but I'm really impressed it has one. I know a lot of younger people tend to favour using the LED LCD screen monitor. Most younger people apparently don't use the viewfinder on cameras these days, but my eyesight's been failing a lot over the last few years, and so for me the viewfinder is invaluable. I have the diopter set to suit my eyesight so that I'm not needing to wear reading glasses to use the camera, and I'm not having to hold the camera back here to look at the screen. I believe the older viewfinder you had to actually pull it out to deploy it and then push it back in before you closed it, but that's not the case with this one. It's very easy to deploy and very easy to close. So let's talk about my favorite stuff now. What I really like about this camera. I mean, besides the huge focal range and the tiny form factor, the image quality for both photos and videos is outstanding. You can record in RAW with JPEGs, or just JPEG. I pretty much always use RAW. Video is limited to 4K 30p, or 25 if you have the camera set to PAL, which is how I have it set. We're limited to 8-bit 420, but that's pretty much what I would have expected. It might limit your ability to really push the files for grading, but it doesn't make a whole lot of difference to the actual image quality, not to look at, just to grade. One of my all-time favorite features of all of the recent Sony cameras is clear image zoom. This allows you to zoom in an extra 1.5 times digitally without losing much in the way of image quality. I would never use this for photos as it's limited to JPEG and I prefer to work with RAW photos, but for video it's a whole other story. Your 200mm lens is suddenly a 300mm lens now, and for the life of me, I really can't see the difference. The only issue with using clear image zoom is that your autofocus functions become a bit more limited. I don't think tracking or eye autofocus works when using clear image zoom, but in my experience, the autofocus still does work really well, and it seems to still be using fast phase detect autofocus. I've not noticed any hunting or anything. So if I were needing that extra 100mm on the long end, I wouldn't even hesitate. Some of my favorite shots that I've taken on this camera were done using clear image zoom. So then what about autofocus tracking for photos? Things like animal eye autofocus. The autofocus is generally really good. I have found it a little bit less reliable when it comes to tracking wildlife. My hit rate was quite a bit lower when I was at the zoo, but then I hadn't really used the camera a lot of that time, so I might have found that my hit rate would be a lot better now. That said, I still managed to get plenty of nice shots. The crazy fast burst rates are fun to play with, but the first time I went to the zoo with this camera, I was using like a 64 gig SD card and managed to run out of space in about 10 minutes. You'll definitely want a large capacity card if you're planning to use those burst rates. Doesn't need to be the fastest card in the market though. The RX100 Mark 7 doesn't even support UHS 2, which means you can use a UHS 1 card. Save yourself a little money. Those super fast burst rates make this camera pretty ideal for outdoor sports, as does the longer focal range. The smaller sensor would probably limit its usability for low light indoor sports, but I don't really have that much experience with sports photography, so take what I have to say with a grain of salt. For wildlife, it's not too bad, but I would generally prefer a longer focal length. Ideally up to 600mm would be great. With the 1-inch sensor, I wouldn't have expected that you get much shallow depth of field with this camera, but I've actually been pretty surprised. With a bit of planning outside at longer focal lengths with a distant background, it's possible to get some nice blurry backgrounds. Bokeh's a little busy at times, but that should hardly be a surprise. Creamy backgrounds are not what this camera was made for, but at a pinch. It does have a flash, for what it's worth. I rarely ever use a flash, so I don't really have much to say there. You can pull the flash back though to bounce it off the ceiling, which is pretty useful for creating a more flattering portrait. Looks a lot nicer than flashing a light directly in someone's face. So, yeah. In conclusion, I guess this camera is ideal for anybody who wants the absolute best performance with as few compromises as possible in a form factor that can fit into your pants pocket. It's ideal for travel, outdoor sports, wildlife that's not too far away. It's probably pretty awesome for street photography. With its smaller sensor, it's probably not ideal for portraiture, but with a bit of planning, putting your subject in front of a background that's not too distracting, it's probably still pretty good for that too, I guess. The lens on this camera is really nice and sharp at pretty much every focal length. While a lot of cameras are starting to move to higher resolution sensors, the RX100 Mark 7 has a 20-point-something sensor, which is a pretty good resolution as far as I'm concerned for a 1-inch sensor. You really wouldn't want to be squeezing any more megapixels onto a sensor this size. So if you have too much money and I can't convince you to give it to me, or you're just a bit of a camera snob like myself, then this may be the pocketable camera you're looking for. Let me know in the comments what you think about this camera, and I'll leave some links below for the accessories I've talked about in this video. They're not affiliate links or anything. If you have any questions, ask away and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.